Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am most every week, by my co-host Richard Ebeing, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard took a nice, relaxing week off while I was slaving away doing Libertarian Angle on my own. Richard, it's good to see you. You look nice and rested.
Well, I had a traumatizing experience too. I mean, it's not easy to prepare Thanksgiving dinner for about a dozen people. And while my wife will, I'm sure, claim credit that she made the butternut squash soup and she prepared the homemade pumpkin pie, if it wasn't for my labors of cutting the squash and cutting the pumpkins, there wouldn't have been a soup or a pie. So, I mean, who's important in these processes? But now that's how we spent our week. And as I always want to do, as we are sitting down at the Thanksgiving table, and before I start carving up the turkey, I remind the people who have joined us of the original Thanksgiving story, that the Pilgrims had come to America. They decided to follow the Platonic example in Plato's Republic of communalism, communism, and how it led to an economic disaster of starvation for the young colonists, and that in fact the colony was saved only by them establishing private property in individual family farms, and prosperity was forthcoming through applying initiative and self-interest that took the colony from near being wiped out to an emerging prosperity. So I always explain to our guests that Thanksgiving is really the celebration of the birth of free enterprise in America. And that sort of fits in as with the theme that we've been discussing the last few sessions of our meetings on Libertarian Angle about the meaning and importance and danger of socialism.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, if any of our viewers are new to the Future of Freedom Foundation and this is your first exposure, I would invite you to subscribe to our FFF Daily, because like for example, on Thursday, on Thanksgiving, we had a special Thanksgiving Day issue with several articles, 10 articles, that explain exactly what Richard's talking about. And so I invite y'all to subscribe, free for the asking. So yeah, we're talking about socialism. This is our third part of our series on socialism. We start out, Richard, by talking about the socialist ideal, where the state owns everything, the means of production, the results of production. The only thing people are allowed to own are maybe their toothbrushes and a few personal belongings, you know. But by and large, the homes, everything, and everybody works for the state. So we analyzed that, and then we talked about how socialism began getting imported into the United States in the late 1800s through the progressive movement, how that came to be. It was part of this worldwide trend toward looking to government for security and safety for the vicissitudes of life. And so we're almost ready to start analyzing specific socialist programs in America. But there's another aspect that perhaps we ought to cover, and that's the role that National Socialism played in the overall paradigm of socialism. I'm referring, of course, to Nazi Germany. That was an abbreviation for National Socialist. And then at the same time, or about the same time, there was Benito Mussolini's paradigm there called fascism or economic fascism. So I thought it would be important to kind of compare these kind of isms and analyze where they fit into the overall schematic of socialism. And before I turn it over to you, because you know a lot more about this subject than I do, the thing that comes to my mind is a great book called Three New Deals by a guy named Wolfgang Schivelbusch that's available on Amazon. I'd recommend anybody reading it. But what Schivelbusch does is he compares the New Deal in America under Franklin Roosevelt with what was happening in Nazi Germany at the same time in the 1930s and what was happening around the same time in fascist Italy. And Schivelbusch analysis arrives at the conclusion that there were remarkable similarities taking place in all three countries, especially as part of the effort to combat the Great Depression. But it gives our readers somewhat of a prelude as we analyze National Socialism and what was happening in Italy to the major transformation toward a socialist or a socialistic system here in the United States, primarily through the adoption of the welfare state way of life and the managed regulated economy way of life. So why don't you take it from here, Richard, and tell us a little bit about where National Socialism and fascism in Italy fit into the overall paradigm of socialism itself.
Yeah, now, a good way to start is to debunk a myth. And it has been common since the 1930s and was really an argument and sort of a lexicon of terms and perspectives that was developed out of the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, there were three rival forms of collectivism in Europe, and they were the Soviet Union representing Marxian socialism or communism. There was Hitler's National Socialism in Germany after Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933, and then there was Italian fascism, which came to power in Italy under Mussolini's leadership even earlier in 1922. Now, the usual way that it has come to be portrayed is that socialism and communism on a political spectrum is on the left, whereas fascism and Nazism, National Socialism, are somehow on the right. And to try to explain how the Soviet systems, Marxism, differed from fascism and Nazism, the left, and particularly out of the propaganda elements in the Soviet Union, started saying is that their collectivisms are false collectivisms. They're really the dying gasps of brute force to maintain the evil and exploitive and unjust capitalist system. So fascism and Nazism are really capitalism with a brutal face. And what was happening in the Soviet Union on the left represented the society of the future, the people in charge, equality, justice, a liberating of man from the exploitation of capitalism. Now, this notion of the left and the right, and communism on the left, and Nazism and fascism on the right, is totally absurd. The fact is that both fascism and National Socialism, Nazism, has its origin in the same collectivist mindset as either democratic socialism and certainly Marxian socialism or Soviet communism. And that is the idea that the collective, the tribe, the group is primary and the individual is secondary. Now, in the Marxian and general socialist lexicon, the distinction between people and society is defined by their social class. And Marx and other socialists define this as how does the individual relate to the ownership of property? If an individual is an owner of the means of production, land, capital, resources, raw materials, out of which products are produced, if the individual is part of the structure of ownership of the means of production, he is part of the exploiting capitalist class. If the individual is part of the non-owning proletarian class that has to sell its labor to the capitalists to have access to the machines without which they cannot produce enough for them and their families to stay alive, they're part of the exploited class. So society is divided into social classes. This defines you, identifies you, and dictates your fate, in fact. But there were other currents in the second half of the 19th century besides socialism in general, and particularly the Marxian variation, and that was nationalism and racialism. The emerging nationalism of the late 19th century emphasized the paramount nature of the nation state. The individual is born into a national group. You could be Spanish, you could be Italian, you could be French, you could be German. but that group defines who you are. It's your language, your heritage, your ethnicity, your very sense of identity and belonging. And furthermore, the individual, he passes away. The nation continues, generation after generation. Therefore, the nation and its survival, its prosperity, its growth, its paramountcy takes precedence over the individual who is born, lives as a member of a nation state, and then passes away. Now, a variation of that nationalism was developed by Benito Mussolini. Now, before the First World War, but Mussolini, in fact, was one of the most prominent socialists in Italy. He was the editor of the leading socialist newspaper in Italy. Avanti was its title. But during the First World War, he came to feel that Italy was not ready for a transformation to a full socialism. It needed to be made coherent as a political unit. And this coherence as a political unit, he believed, required to transcend the Marxian class distinctions and to see the need of unifying and solidifying the nation state. So what happens is the conflicts of the world are not between social classes, the capitalists versus the workers, but between the nations for access of the resources of the world and a place in the sun for the nation state to be great, so that the individual member of that nation state, as part of that country, is great himself. So after the First World War, and Mussolini's enthusiasm for Italy's part in the First World War on the Allied side against Germany and Austria-Hungary, as a means of unifying the Italian national character and bringing all classes together for national greatness, he was condemned by the traditional Marxian socialists. But he said that his was the truer socialism. All members of the society have a common interest, the greatness of their nation. And the only variation that he therefore made was that his collectivism is nation-state identity and conflict. Either Italy is great or some other country is great. But within Italy, rather than calling, as the Marxians were, and with the coming of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia during the First World War, Lenin and his government, he didn't call for the nationalization of the means of production and the destruction of quote, the capitalists. What he said is that all are subservient to the purposes of the state. And there's a division of labor. There are managers, there are people who are skilled and unskilled workers. And what instead we're going to do is we're going to take the industries and the agricultural sectors of the society and put them into government constructed and mandated cartels. That is, steel production, manufacturing of various types. And every company and enterprise within that sector of the economy is required to be part of that government-mandated cartel. All workers are forced into government-mandated trade unions. And then the government, in like a triangle of the government on top, and at one side business, and at the other side labor, all of them will be brought together under the government's harmonious direction of setting prices, setting wages, determining production quotas, allocating the distribution of outputs from the firms to whom and for what purposes and in what quantities. So what Mussolini was setting up was a planned economy based upon government-mandated cartels in which businessmen are reduced to nothing more than, if you will, the managers of their enterprise to serve the purposes of the state. So that became the fascist form of collectivism. The nation state and separate nations being in a conflict versus social classes and a class warfare on an international level. Now, the other variation of this became National Socialism. Now, in the late 19th century, the other element that was emerging, and often parallel but distinct from nationalism, because nationalism could be based upon an identity of where you're born and how you were brought up and what language you speak. But the other variation is that what determines your collective identity, that is what group or tribe you belong to, was your race. And this racialism was emerging not only, but especially in Germany in the late 19th century, what made you a German was not that just you were born in Germany, that you necessarily spoke German as a language, but the genetic heritage that was in your blood. So that now the collectivist identities were you Germanic by blood, were you Slavic by blood, were you African blood, were you Asian by blood. And now the conflicts are between racial groups. Now, in the National Socialist and the Nazi conception of this, there are some groups that are superior to others. There is the German. He is the pure Austrian. He comes from the highest form of this, the Aryan race, the perfect Nordic type, of which the German is the perfection of the Nordic type. You're blonde, you're blue eyes, you have a white skin, you're born to be a warlike athlete, yes, and we shall rule the world. Now, the conflicts, therefore, are all Germans have one common collective purpose: to improve their society, develop their qualities and characteristics, breed the best that is in their genes. And part of the central planning of Nazi Germany was genetic breeding. The government goal was to bring together those they defined as genetically better or superior to make a super race and to weed out all the inferior types, both even within the Germans and all non-Germans who would not even be serviceable to serve their German masters. So this becomes the National Socialist version of collectivism. It's not social classes. It's not nation states defined in a broader way. It is now race that defines it. The German genetic race compared to the French, compared to the Russian, compared to the Asian or the African, etc. And now there's a hierarchy of races. Now, the other element of this is that, like Soviet socialism, like Italian fascism, German National Socialism believes that all interests are subservient to the interests of the race, which means the government plans the economy. If under Stalin, beginning in the early 1920s, the Soviet Union introduced the 5-year central plan, beginning in 1936, that is just 3 years after Hitler came to power, the German government established the 4-year central plan. Governments would set wages and prices, dictate how much would be produced of different products, establish to whom outputs would be distributed to other firms or enterprises or retail stores. So again, a completely planned economy in which the individual entrepreneur becomes merely a shopkeeper and a manager for the dictates of the state. There is an excellent book about this, published in 1939 by a German economist who had come to the United States, called Gunther Reimann, and it's called The Vampire Economy: Doing Business under Fascism. And he explains in intricate detail how the National Socialists, the Nazi economy, worked on these lines: the end to private enterprise, the end to individual freedom, the abridgment of any sense of the individual having any identity to himself. So what we see in this is that there were three competing collectivisms in especially the first half of the 20th century: Soviet socialism, Italian fascism, German Nazism. But their all commonality is the individual is subservient to the group. The economy is to be organized and directed in some institutional way that makes the government paramount in directing, planning, commanding, controlling, prohibiting, or requiring each and every aspect of how the system works. Now, the term totalitarian was actually coined by Mussolini in the 1920s. In an article he wrote about fascism for an Italian encyclopedia. And basically he said, nothing outside of the state, nothing above the state, nothing except for the state, which means the individual is reduced to a cog in the machine. And therefore, all of these disputes about, what's left and what's right, what's capitalist, what's really socialist, is all a misunderstanding that this is a common tree in which there are three different branches. Now, there's another element to this, because you were mentioning the New Deal, Jacob, that I think should be brought out and highlight what you began with. In the 1920s, there were a lot of American intellectuals, including writers of The Nation magazine, The New Republic, which are considered, banner publications today for progressivism. These magazines published articles highly sympathetic and sometimes praising of Mussolini's fascism. Mussolini has found a way to transcend the divisions and the conflicts among classes in society. All of them are harmoniously brought together for the betterment and prosperity of the nation through the government's control of justice and fairness in industry, with setting prices and wages and work conditions, labor getting their fair share, and participating in the economy under the government's cartel arrangements. And that, in fact, when the Great Depression struck, what you find in the early 1930s, already under the Hoover years, and then particularly with Roosevelt coming, is they said, what is the solution for America? America must have a variation on Mussolini's fascist theme. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater like the communists want. Kill the capitalists and only the workers. No. Businessmen have managerial skills. Let them be there, but serving the ends and purposes and the directions that the state assigned them to for the national good. So then when Roosevelt comes to power in 1933, he sets up what is known as the NRA. No, not the National Riflemen's Association, the National Industrial Recovery Act. And basically this is modeled after Mussolini's Italy. All American industry were forced into government cartels. And the National Recovery Administration said wages, prices, work conditions, output levels, the distribution of outputs to different sources from that point. And the same with agriculture. AAA, having nothing to do with the Automobile Association, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, in which farming was put under government control, of the government setting production quotas for crops, for the size of livestock, for the amounts to be grown, at what prices. All of this was now the planned economy on a fascist model, and intentionally so. So all of these, all that we saw in the 20th century, including during the New Deal, until the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional in 1936, as a variety of cases came before it, challenging the federal government's right to command everybody in their economic affairs in this way, was the realization that what we are facing is not just socialism in a Soviet form, but a socialism that encompasses different variations on the same theme. Is it the nations that are at war? Is it the races that are at war? Or is it the classes that are at war? But notice all of the commonalities, Jacob. The collective is the reality, the individual is not. The society is defined by the collective distinctions. The individual is just taken along for the ride as a subject and an element subservient to the greater good. Now, what we see in the world today are mixes of these things. We have, in the sense, advocates of old-fashioned, quote, democratic socialism with wide government ownership and command of the economy. But then you have these people who are other forms of socialists who say, well, you're not going to manage and directly control the economy, but we're going to have interventionist rules and regulations. What wages, what prices, what methods of production, right? This is the Green New Deal, is it not? Oh, to save the planet, we must tell businesses what sources of energy they are to use, what outputs are to be produced. We have to retrofit the way everybody lives and works to make it environmentally safe. It's basically a blending of government ownership and government fascist type command of the American economy. That is the vision of the Green New Dealers. So in fact, this is the reality of the future that we're facing and are living with. And so in fact, what we have are the blendings of nation and class. And I know I'm talking a lot, Jacob, and I apologize. But one more theme on this, because it seems like, well, yeah, economic fascism, socialist attitudes about class. What happened to race? Well, that's Nazism. We reject that. Well, not so. This has arisen again in America as well, Jacob. In what form? Identity politics. What race or gender do you belong to? What has been the exploitive and ruling and unjust ruling group? White, male, men who have used capitalism, private ownership, to suppress minority groups, people of color, women, so that in fact there is a new collectivist variation on the National Socialist theme that is arising to the fore in America, so that we see therefore traditional socialism, fascist economics, and through identity politics, the revival of a new version, a progressive version of race and gender identity, all of which makes the individual nothing and the group everything.
All right, you mentioned that Germany was involved in planning with respect to genetics, trying to get the better race and breeding in a centrally planned way. Wasn't this based on the eugenics movement here in the United States? And wasn't that itself part of the progressive movement that was introducing socialist ideas to the United States?
Actually, it began in Great Britain by a number of genetic scientists or people who believed they understood genetics. Their idea was this, is that we breed animals, do we not? A better strain of cows, a better breed of horses. Now, if we can breed and learning how to breed and interbreed to have stronger crops, right? Better wheat, wheat that can be grown in parts of the year that normally would not occur naturally. Do we not breed dogs? In fact, and I was surprised by this until I read a few things. Up until the 19th century, the number of dog breeds were a handful. All of these different variations, big dogs, little dogs, different breeding of poodles and Labradors and stuff. This is all these multiples of different dog breeds is only about 150 years old compared to what was before. So if we can breed animals, if we can breed stronger strains of crops, why can't we breed people? Now, while this idea began in some ways in Britain, it caught fire in both Germany and the United States. There were eugenetic societies. In fact, you may remember, Jacob, that years ago, when the Future of Freedom magazine, monthly publication used to be called Freedom Daily, I in fact did a review of a book about this called The Nazi Connection, and that is the American link to the eugenics movement with what emerged in Germany under Nazism. And this was extremely popular. Let me just give an example of this from the people I'd be most familiar with, famous economists. Irving Fisher, professor at Yale University in the first half of the 20th century, one of the leading monetary theorists of the 20th century, the quantity theory of money. You read his 1911 Elementary Principles of Economics. He has a chapter on eugenic breeding of people. You turn to another famous economist, Frank Taussig, one of the leading economists in the early decades of the 20th century. He taught at Harvard University. You turn to his Principles of Economics, which came out in 1913. He has a chapter on breeding people. And he says the only problem with being able to successfully do this is that, for people prefer to pick their own for breeding, for having children. My gosh, if we could only overcome the emotion, action, and love, we can have better people. Now, this sounds bizarre to us today, but the fact is, these were mainstream views. Family planning. Margaret Sanger, she believed in eugenics and controlling the breeding of inferior types. State governments in the United States had laws on the books allowing compulsory sterilization. And the Supreme Court at one point approved that. And you have the legal background, Jacob. I'm not sure if the Supreme Court ever made another decision later on overthrowing that one of allowing some of this at the state level. So in principle, it's still hypothetically constitutional. And of course, the Germans latched onto this because of their racialist version of nationalism in the late 19th and 20th century. So you are absolutely right. These are variations on the collectivist theme that derive from the idea of breeding people, another form of central planning.
Yeah, and it was a worldwide phenomenon. That's what a lot of people don't realize, is that this trend towards socialism in all its variations, government ownership, control, central planning, was sweeping across the world like slowly building and ultimately resulting in a tsunami in the direction of central planning, socialism, and so forth. Another aspect of the German model that I think is worth touching on is that the Germans didn't advocate, like the Soviets were doing, government ownership of the means of production. They weren't taking over everything, the homes, the businesses, the industries, and so forth. That they would leave the businesses, the industries, in nominal private ownership. So it had the appearance of a free enterprise system. But in fact, the government was managing and controlling these privately owned industries in a way that effectively made them subsidiaries of this giant government machinery, right?
Yes. The German attitude is that businessmen have certain managerial skills and industrial directing capacities. The problem with liberalism, by which of course they understood rightly classical liberalism, is that it leaves individuals to just pursue their self-interest guided by a profit motive of producing what they think will sell the most to earn them the most. That does not necessarily serve the national interest. If we're going to make Germany great again, it is necessary to make the individuals subservient to the needs of the state. So businesses are to be told or commanded what they'll produce, where they'll produce, how much they'll produce, what prices at which they'll sell it, the wages and work conditions there to be provided for their employees. There is, in one sense, an equality among all Germans as a racial group, as opposed to the inferiorities of all the other races who eventually must be made subservient to the master race. The Germans loved Hitler. I'm not saying every German, that's of course be stupid, but many Germans, because he talked about an equality of real Germans. Free college, right? Opportunities to advance to professions and occupations that had been closed off in an earlier traditionalist feudal type arrangement of pecking orders in the structures of the society. For many Germans, Hitler was progressive. He's breaking down class barriers. He's giving those in the lower classes the opportunity to become participating members in the national betterment of the society. We're all Germans serving the greater national socialist purpose. So, and I should mention a couple of other things. There was also, there are things that are bad for people. So there were campaigns against smoking. Oh yes, cancer is caused by smoking. And now we have to ban that because we have to have a healthier and we have to have a purer race, including because, government covers a growing number of the healthcare costs of the society. Unless we can control what people ingest in their systems, that's going to negatively affect the cost of healthcare for all. So we have to control how you live to control the costs of healthcare. So there's nothing new under the sun here that people would say in their own ways today. And that was all in the Nazi model.
All right, so we've really laid the foundation for the transformation that takes place in the United States. And it begins in the late 1800s, the importation of socialist ideas by the progressive movement. It starts to build up steam in the early part of the 1900s. Compounding this, of course, is the move toward imperialism and interventionism with respect to foreign policy. Spanish-American War, World War I. But the whole thing starts building up steam in the 1920s. We've got the Federal Reserve System coming in. We've got the national income tax coming in. So why don't we devote the next segment to analyzing what is happening all the way up to the Roosevelt administration, which was really the watershed period. I mean, that's
Yes.
what completed this major transformation, revolutionary transformation. That's where the tsunami really just overtook the entire United States. So we'll get to that, but as a hint, just of things to come, there's that famous letter that Roosevelt that Hitler sends to Roosevelt through the U.S. ambassador, commending Roosevelt on his economic policies because he's placing the greater good of society, the collective, against over and above the private selfish interests of the individual. And he's telling Roosevelt, I want to commend you on this because we're following the same types of policies here in Nazi Germany. So it gives a little hint of things to come. But
Yeah, if I can just sort of follow what that just for a second. I think it was around 1934, Newsweek magazine did an interview with Mussolini in Italy. And Mussolini heralded Roosevelt, calling him a social fascist, someone who too was placing the interests of the nation as a whole over the wrong-headed liberal notions of the freedom of the individual. So both Hitler and Mussolini were seeing FDR as a kindred soul.
yeah, and that brings us back to the very beginning of the show, where Wolfgang Schibelbusch, that's the theme of his book, Three New Deals, is the similarities of what was taking place during the Roosevelt administration and at the same time during the Hitler administration and the Mussolini administration in Italy. So on that note, Richard, we need to wrap it up. We're out of time, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Until next week, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Again, if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, subscribe to our FFF Daily. That's free. Subscribe to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. That has a subscription price of $25 or $15 for the email version. Come to our website. We have, just thousands of articles, videotapes, and perspectives, all delivering the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next week.